Bismillah.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we continue our preparation for Ramadan. This time we are going to be studying the book Way to the Quran by Khuram, Murad. So we are now about 2 weeks into the month of Ramadan, into the preparation for the month of Ramadan, and it's coming fast. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to ensure that we had a proper understanding of how it is that we should approach the Quran. The book, The Way to the Quran, is very interesting because the author, may Allah have mercy on him, he wrote it in a way that he wanted to be very simple in his approach. He wanted to be very simple in his approach, and he wanted to make sure that the understanding that we have is one which is simple from the angle of it being a personal relationship with the Quran. And he talks about that in his preface. He says that his book is very modest and he is not presuming to be a scholar of tafsir, but he wrote this book especially for young people and women who are struggling with their desire to understand the Quran, to absorb it and to live it. There are 7 key areas of study in this book. One is the conversation about the Quran itself. The second is the basic prerequisites to study of the Quran, the reading of the Quran, worship with the Quran. And then the third is a little more complicated because he starts talking about our inner lives. He talks about what's going on in the spiritual sense, or what should be happening in the spiritual sense in our relationship with the Quran. And he talks about rules of reading. And then he gets into something that's a little more academic, which he talks about the study and the understanding of the Quran. And then there's a unique point here. He goes from talking about the inner dynamics or the spiritual side of reading the Quran to us having an understanding of how to approach the Quran by way of rules. And then he goes into us studying the Quran as a group, as a collective. And that's something which is very unique. And then finally, after the whole angle of what our attitude should be toward the Quran, how we should understand the Quran in this study, then there's the issue of application. There's the issue of application. And one of the things that he mentions, which is the way that he puts it is very interesting from the angle that it should be the thinking of every Muslim. He says that it's our right to experience the Quran in the way that the first generation experienced the Quran. It's our right to experience the Quran in the way that the first generation experienced the Quran. One of the things that we start off with when we start talking about the Quran is that we have to understand that the Quran is an eternal and living reality. The Quran is revelation, and it's been sent down to us to guide us in a number of different directions. It's not just the issue of telling us what to do from the angle of do this, don't do that. It's not just from the angle of inspiring us and comforting us in moments of hardship and trial and tribulation. But the Quran, it also teaches us about the reality of existence. It teaches us about the universe. It teaches us about ourselves, our relationships to one another. It teaches us about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, which is central to all of that. And it teaches us about what comes with death, what comes in the hereafter. And so one of the things that we have to have as a first principle is this idea that the Quran comes from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that it is a source of revelation. And so then there's the belief that it's a source of revelation, and it's the same revelation that came to the early generation, is the same revelation that was given to Jibreel, the angel of revelation, who transmitted it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who transmitted it to the companions. So we find that it is the same revelation that came to guide that generation, which was the model generation, and that's what he wants to put us in tune with. He wants to put us in tune with the fact that that generation was guided by the Quran, and it was a generation which had a lot of difficulties. It was a generation which had a lot of things to work on as far as themselves. It was a generation which was not necessarily a perfect generation, but the Quran built them and cultivated them, and it made them a holistic people. It made them human beings. And so the question that he poses is, can we have a relationship with the Quran, in today's time, as the early generation had a relationship with the Quran? And he definitely answers that in the affirmative. And he talks about that there's some difficulties in this endeavor or this undertaking or this mission or this goal of trying to have the same experience, that encounter with the Quran that's dynamic, that's changing, in which we see the Quran as a source of guidance for us, in which we build the relationship with the Quran. And so that's the objective of the book. The objective of the book is to give us some tools to recreate that relationship, right? So he says, that first principle has to be kept in mind. We must realize what the Quran is as the word of God, what it means to us. And we must, have respect for it, love for it, longing, right? And then we must seek to fulfill his commands, right? And so one of the things that we have to understand is that, the Quran, it comes in the Arabic language. And because it comes in the Arabic language, it follows a particular pattern of address. And that's one of the things that he wants to familiarize us with, is how it is, in a simple way, how it is that the Quran conveys his meaning to us, right? And so once we can understand the language of the Quran, so to speak, then we can get into the whole point of understanding the Quran, and then finally we can get into the point of practicing the Quran. There's no, sometimes the scholars get into defining the Quran, and they say things like the Quran is that which was revealed to the angel Jibreel, who revealed it to or transmitted it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Arabic language. It begins with Surah Al-Fatiha, ends with Surah Al-Nas, and is contained in the Mus'haf, and it's miraculous and is not matchable, is not reproducible, and is considered a miracle. Sometimes you'll see in the books of sciences of the Quran definitions such as this. But one of the things that we're told in the way to the Quran is that in reality is beyond our comprehension, right? To really understand what the Quran is by way of definition, right? We must have some sort of idea of what it means to us. That's the important thing. What does the Quran mean to us, right? So that we're inspired to have a relationship with the Quran and give ourselves to the Quran in a commitment, right? With dedication, with consistency, and to follow his demands. So he doesn't want us to get stuck with the idea that we define the Quran in mind and then all of a sudden we think that we know what the Quran is. But he wants us to keep in mind that it is revelation and it's really something that's coming from Allah. It's miraculous, and really that we won't be able to understand the Quran unless we have some sort of relationship to it. The Quran is the word of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and it has been transmitted to us in a language that human beings use, right? And that's the key point. One of the things that we confront also is that there are, some challenges that we may encounter, right? And those challenges that we may encounter come from ourselves at times, right? That the challenges that we may encounter in life overall, they come from not having a sense of guidance. And so when we look at those challenges, right, and that we trust that the Quran is there to guide us through those challenges, right, then we begin to have a different type of relationship, with the Quran itself, because then we see it as our GPS, so to speak, that's giving us a sense of direction. And then that's in the sense of life. And sometimes the challenges may come that we don't really have a connection with the Quran. We don't have a connection with the Quran. So one of the things that he brings up is the issue of Tilawah, Tilawah is the recitation of the Quran, right? Is the reading of the Quran. And so with the tilawah of the Quran, we begin to find ourselves in the situation in which we should look at the Quran, not just that we're reading it for the sake of barakah, for the sake of reward, but we're reading it for the sake of harakah, or for the sake of implementing it. And so if we want to implement it, we have that belief that the Quran itself is guidance. So one of the things that he highlights here, which is a little different than what we would read in the book that pertains to the rules for recitation of the Quran, is that the act of reciting the Quran is an act which the whole of our person, our soul, our heart, our mind, our tongue, and body participates in. And so, that's the initial point when it comes to reading the Quran that he wants us to reflect upon, that the whole of our person overall should be immersed in the act of tilawah, the whole of our person, right? And so he says that this is not a light task. It's not a light task. It presents some challenges to it. Sure, it's true. In the digital age, we're used to going from one thing to another. We become distracted. And so this idea of tilawah that he's mentioning is that we become immersed. We become immersed in that world. Sometimes some of our youth may have that experience. They play video games and they become immersed in that reality. That is the reality that exists for them. Nothing else exists. There's no outer noise. There's no outer stimulation, but that's the reality. And so that's kind of what he wants us to understand in the first chapter, that the Quran is the word of Allah wa ta'ala. It comes from Allah. It's a book of guidance. And that how we should approach it is with that understanding, that the Quran is a book that comes from Allah wa ta'ala, and that our reading of it should be one in which we surrender the whole of ourselves. We should be immersed in its recitation with all aspects of our being, whether physical or spiritual. And in chapter 2, he begins to talk about the prerequisites to the reading of the Quran. And in the first sense, he repeats a little of what was said already, and that's to have iman that the Quran is the word of Allah wa ta'ala, or is the speech of Allah, it's revelation. This is important because this is what separates the Quran from any other book that we're reading, from a self-help book, from any other book that we may be reading, and actually any other information that we may come across, whether it's a video, or whether it's a lecture. The Quran should have that precedence, that we separate it from any other source of information and knowledge with that principle that it is revelation and that it comes from Allah wa ta'ala, that it comes from Allah. But he doesn't stop there. He tells us, that we should be thinking of Allah when we're reading the Quran, right? It's not just the issue, of admiring the Quran, but we should be thinking of who it is that the Quran comes from, right? And so here he says something really nice. Think of his majesty and glory and power, and you will feel awe and reverence and devotion for his words. Reflect on the sustenance that comes from Allah and the mercy that comes from Allah and compassion, and you will be filled with gratitude and love and longing for his message. Know that his wisdom and knowledge and kindness, are there, and you will become willing and eager and ready to obey his commands. So that's the transformation of attitude. That's the transformation of attitude, that we're encountering the Quran, and we know that it's a book of guidance. We know that it's revelation. So it's not just an inspiring book. We know that we should recite it in such a way in which we're committed to it in totality. In other words, we're immersed in it, we're engrossed in it with our whole being, with our hearts, with our minds, with our eyes, even with our ears and listening. And then from there, we're trying to move to understanding it so that we can implement it. But before we get there, in that process of being immersed in reading the Quran, we should know that it comes from Allah, and we should be thinking about Allah in the sense of the majesty of Allah and the glory of Allah and the power of Allah, and have that feeling of awe and reverence for Allah and devotion to it. So that is an act of connecting with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so that's really a unique point that he brings, is that he's showing us that this is where a lot of us, when we read the Quran, there may be a gap between ourselves and the Quran, that we don't have that connection in that way, because our attitude is not necessarily that. Our attitude is more intellectual when we're approaching the Quran. But it's not an attitude that we're thinking that this is revelation, it comes from Allah, and who is Allah. So that's the initial stage that we need to take for preparing ourselves. Another point that he mentions is the issue of intention, right? That we should read the Quran with a purity of intention and a singular purpose. And that is to receive guidance from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. That is to receive guidance. So he talked about the Quran as being guidance. Now he's talking about what should be our approach, our spiritual orientation, as a prerequisite to take benefit from the guidance. Another thing is that, that we should become people of gratitude and praise. People of gratitude and praise. And so first we have to work on our intention. And we're working on our intention that we're reading the Quran to gain guidance from it. So we have the proper intention. And we have that intention with an understanding that the Quran comes from Allah. So now he talks about the issue of gratitude and praise. Right? And he says, make yourself constantly alert with intense praise and gratitude towards your Rabb for having blessed you with the greatest gift, right, that comes from Allah, which is the Quran, and for having guided you to its reading and study. So that's another dimension in how we should orient ourselves or prepare ourselves to reading the Quran, is that we should have gratitude, and that's to show thankfulness, right? And then praise and praising Allah, alhamdulillah, for the ni'mah of Islam, for the blessing of Islam, for guiding us, for giving us the Quran, so that puts us in a state of openness, And then he talks about the importance of acceptance and trust, right? To accept and trust without doubt, without the least doubt or hesitation, every knowledge and guidance that comes from the Quran. And so with that, there's a connection that we have. It's not just a connection of the heart, and not just a connection of feeling, but now where is a connection of trust, right? Is a connection of surrender, right? Is a connection of surrender. It's not just feeling good about the Quran or feeling that the Quran comes from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, or that the Quran is a book of guidance, and then we leave it at that, and then what goes on in our minds is a series of doubts. But now he's saying that we should accept and trust. And so that reels in our minds. So then the issue becomes more of focusing our mind on understanding. We trust that it's a book of Allah. So any doubts that may come in our mind, we set those aside, and we're more focused on understanding. We're not preoccupied with the issue of doubts and the issue of confusion. We're more focused on getting guidance, And so we go from a standard understanding that the Quran is a book of guidance to seeking guidance by our intention, right? To the issue of trusting, right, in Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to give us guidance, right? And making that connection with Allah and knowing that Allah is great and being thankful for that, and then accepting it as guidance. And so that we're submitting to the Quran more and more in that sense. And with that, it may be true, it may be the case that in that process of gaining confidence in the Quran or trying to accept the Quran as true, we may not understand certain things. And that, resolves itself with knowledge. But the first principle is that we have to accept the Quran as true. But there may be things that we encounter that we may not understand. There may be situations where we may be like, what just happened there? Like, why is that? And that's natural in the process of study, but it shouldn't get to a point where we undermine our own confidence in the Quran. And so we have to resolve those types of issues with study. And that's why it's important to have some personal relationship with the Quran initially, and then to be able to associate with those who have a good, solid understanding of the Quran. And so one of the things that he mentions is to accept the Quran as a whole, and not just to accept one part of the Quran and reject another part of the Quran. And that's part of believing in the Quran as being revelation. The fifth principle that he mentions is the issue of obedience and change, right? And he says, bring the will, resolve, and readiness to obey whatever the Quran says, and change your life, attitude, and behavior inwardly and outwardly as desired by it. And really, this, what he says here, is one of the principles that we find that qualifies or is characteristic of the companions. The companions, that was the attitude that they had toward the Quran, that they were willing to change and adapt according to the commands and dictates of revelation as they came, if it was needed for them to change and transform themselves. If it was that their behavior clashed with the Quran, they were trying to conform themselves with the values and the commands of the Quran, the characteristics of the Quran. They were trying to encounter the Quran in a way in which their spirit was one of openness and obedience. And lastly, in this chapter, chapter 2, he says that there are some hazards and obstacles. He says, always remain aware that as you embark upon reading the Quran, Shaitan will create every possible hazard and obstacle to stalk you on your way to the great riches of the Quran. And that's why I was just mentioning that we may study the Quran and we may encounter things which may confuse us. You know, that's something that we have to be open with. Sometimes when we, as imams, teachers, educators, scholars, leaders, sometimes in the presentation of information, we remove ourselves from the struggles of the people. We become academic, and that has its time and its place. But there's also a time to recognize, right, that people struggle. They struggle. And so what we may ask for people to consider or follow in the realm of knowledge and academia, it may not be where people are at. And so that's one of the things that he, wants to emphasize, that look, I'm writing this book in a way so that it can be for all people. It's not necessarily some high scholarly work that is only accessible by a certain group of people, but I want the everyday person, whoever that person may be, whether they may be a scholar or not, people that are just engaged in life, not necessarily just focus in the books, but people that have to work, people that have children, people that are struggling, teenagers going to school. I want everyone and that live that everyday life reality, to prepare themselves to encounter the Quran. And I want you to know that, yes, part of encountering the Quran is that you will, also encounter obstacles, and their source can be from Shaitan, and you have to remember that the Quran has to be the objective sense. So what takes you away, you can identify that as problematic. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why is it that I'm removing myself from the Quran? Right? What is it that is stopping me, from the practice of the Quran or from understanding the Quran? But here he says, in this case, he's bringing up a spiritual dimension. The Shaitan will create every possible hazard and obstacle to stalk you on your way to the great riches of the Quran, because the end result of getting to the riches of the Quran is that transformation, which puts us in a solid relationship with Allah wa ta'ala. And it puts us in a mode in which we're not prey or susceptible, or we're not falling weak before the trickery and the suggestions of Shaitan. And so he says, obviously the Quran is guidance from me. It's your most powerful ally and help as you battle all your life against Shaitan. He's trying to bring us into that awareness that the Quran is guidance from Allah wa ta'ala, right? And is that it is our ally through life. It's our ally through life. Hence, from the very first step, when you decide to read the Quran, till the last, when you try to live by it, Shaitan will confront you with many tricks, guiles, illusions, and deceptions, obstacles, and impediments, which you will have to surmount. And that's why it's a process. That's why it's a process. That the reading of the Quran is not just reading for the sake of reading to get the reward and for how nice it may sound, or because it is part of our cultural practice. But the reading of the Quran is for self-transformation, and when it's taken serious, right? When it's taken serious, we may find ourselves in the situation that we may find ourselves in the situation in which we may be confronting struggles. And that's really what I want to highlight, that we may confront a lot of struggles. We may find ourselves that we are in situations in which our behavior may not be necessarily in conformity with the Quran. We may find ourselves in doubt with regard to certain teachings of Islam. We may find ourselves that we have issues with the Muslim community overall, with being part of the Muslim community or being part of this particular community. We may be in different situations, but we still believe in Allah. And we still believe in the Quran, but we find ourselves in a situation that we're trying to figure out how it is that we reconnect. And so one of the things he wants to say is that, look, there's a certain attitude that's there that we should have, but also remember that, there's a struggle that comes along with it. And so it's okay. If you're in any of those situations of struggle, to be able to, come to the Quran, is those things don't present themselves as an obstacle. What presents itself as an obstacle is that we lose confidence in the Quran, that we lose confidence in Allah. And so then if those are the states that we're in, we're losing confidence in Allah, we're losing confidence in the Quran, losing confidence in Islam overall, then we have to go step by step. And we have to believe that Shaitan is the one that is deviating us from being able to have some sort of understanding. And it may be the case that, the dealing with, the community may be difficult, but part of this book, part of the intention, it was written to say that, look, we all have our journey to the Quran. And so we're in this reflection to make way or make a way to the Quran. And so part of that is believing that the Quran is the book of Allah revelation, trusting in Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, trusting that is guidance, having confidence in it, right? And then seeking to understand it, and having that approach that we read it with the encounter of Allah. We thinking about who is Allah and the message that Allah is giving us. And we have that openness to change and transform and to be obedient. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Chapter 3 will come in the next session, and part of what will come up is the issue of the states of our heart and the more spiritual dimensions that are necessary in order to understand. So we also will talk a little bit about the rules of reading the Quran. Those will be the two sections that we'll deal with. Today we, in brief, talked about the Quran, what it is, and the attitude that we should have, and the basic prerequisites, that are necessary in order to take benefit from the Quran. If there's any questions, please. We don't know the language, someone asked. Yes, if we don't know the language of the Quran, we can still gain benefit. That's one of the, especially when we start talking about the tafhim of the Quran, which is the tafsir that one of the primary tafsirs that ICNA uses. Part of the objective of that tafsir is to help us to understand the Quran, even though the language is not there, right? And so yes, definitely, and that's one of the things that Khuram Murad, rahmatullahi alayhi, is mentioning, is that when we're studying the Quran, the issue is what attitude should we have, and so we should have that attitude that we're connecting with Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And so that that's not a language issue. The language issue comes more in its study and how it is that we can understand it. And there's some scholarly angles to that, but that spiritual dimension doesn't necessarily require language from us. And so that's one of the things that he mentions initially, is that when we're studying the Quran, and let's just put it in this way, that we may be studying the meanings of the Quran for those of us who may not be versed in the Arabic language. We're studying the meanings of the Quran. So in that process of studying the meanings of the Quran, it doesn't take away from the whole issue of what kind of connection we should be seeking. So if we're studying the meanings of the Quran, we're studying Surah Al-Fatiha or Al-Baqarah or whatever other surah, even if we're studying the tafsir of it or the meanings of it in the English language, every aspect that we're studying of that surah, we should be intending, to have some sort of connection with Allah. And that's what becomes key. And so books like the Tafhim and other books, what they do is they summarize the meanings of the Quran so that we're able to develop some spiritual connection. But there's no doubt that the language of the Quran gives us intricacies. It gives us details. It gives us more finer points. But there's also no doubt that a lot of work has been put in explicating the Quran and making the Quran clear in a number of different languages so that people develop some connection with the meanings of the Quran, and then they can develop a relationship with Allah, which is one that comes from the heart, with some understanding, enough understanding in order to have a foundation of the deen, and even to be able to deal with some subtleties of meaning. So the language is not an obstacle in that regard. What may be an obstacle with regard to the language is that sometimes when the Quran is recited in the Arabic language, you can feel it in a different way. You can feel it, and especially if you're around people that are Arabic speakers, you see that they have a comprehension of the Quran. You see that they feel it, and so sometimes that feeling, we may want that feeling, and we're looking at how can we get that feeling, if we don't understand the language. And we encourage people to study Arabic. We encourage people to study the Arabic and to devote time and sacrifice for that. That's the only way the Ummah will revive itself, if enough of us make that sacrifice. But as far as our relationship with Allah and our connection with Allah by way of the meanings of the Quran, that doesn't need profound Arabic. It doesn't need profound Arabic. It does need a little bit of study of the Quran and the focus of the Quran. And that's the purpose of this book, The Way to the Quran, is to make the Quran accessible to people who may not be scholars or people who may struggle with these issues. Right? If there's no more, the tafsir, like I said, we recommend, we recommend the tafhim. We recommend the Tadabbur al-Quran by Amin Islahi, Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Those tafhim, I think, is a good starting point. And Ibn Kathir and the Tadabbur al-Quran. There's a number of different tafsir which are out there. There's even some audio lectures that are out there. That come back to the issue of the study of the Quran. But those are the tafsir that people can start with, and at a higher level you have Tafsir al-Qurtubi. And at least Surah Al-Fatiha and Baqarah are translated into the English language. In the Urdu language, there's a lot. In the English language, there's a number of different tafsir. And I'll bring some titles for other tafsir. But again, the tafhim of Maulana Maududi is a good starting point, especially the introductions of the chapters of the Quran. To focus on that is very essential. Very essential. Amin Islahi in Tadabbur al-Quran, there's only 2 volumes translated, which is Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran, I believe it is. But the approach is very beneficial when he does a word-by-word study. And then Ibn Kathir is more focused on hadith and the relationship of the hadith to the Quran itself. And then Qurtubi, at least what's translated in the English language, is Fatiha and Surah Al-Baqarah. It gives you a lot of more detailed issues, right? It gives you a lot of more detailed issues to understand, the Quran. And there's a number of different translations that are out there, as well, that kind of like the Clear Quran is very good, for a very basic introduction to understanding the Quran, because what it does is it gives us the themes of every surah in an easy and accessible way. So those are enough resources, at least, to start off with. The more so-called classical texts are like Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir. There's also actually, a translation of the Tabari for at least chapter for the Fatiha and Surah Al-Baqarah. And I think after the tafhim, after one reads the tafhim really well, then you can go to the other books slowly. You can go to the other books, and no doubt that a teacher is essential in the path of study. But if one is not interested in real deep academic studies, then the tafhim becomes sufficient in order to get an orientation of the Quran. Allahu A'lam. So we'll end on this note. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.